So again, we're going to talk today about brush management and weed management. So I'll start out with a bit about weed management, all about weeds. We'll talk about what a weed is, why we have them, and then we'll talk about some different management options, and then we're going to move into brush, and we'll give a general review of different options you have with brush and how the drought might affect that, and then we'll talk a bit about some updates that I know of. So first, all about weeds. So what is a weed anyway? Basically, the general definition is a weed is a plant that's growing out of place. A lot of times we call that a weed. It may be considered to be a nuisance. Another definition for that is just a plant whose value has not been identified yet. So it may have a value, but one problem is if we can't name that plant, we can't figure out what its value is. And so a lot of times, just blindly, we take out weeds without knowing why we're even doing that. And also, sometimes it's interchanged with forbs. So a forb being a broadleaf plant as opposed to a grass with long linear leaves. So maybe a wildflower will be referred to as a weed, although we tend to have more appreciation for it while it's flowering, and then after that, it's a weed again. So it all depends on your perspective. Again, I talked about this earlier. Sometimes forbs are identified as weeds, but technically you could have a grass that's unwanted in a pasture or a brush species. So I wanted to first go through some things that I like about weeds, just to put that out there first before we talk about how to kill our weeds. So we'll start with the likes, and the first one being that they're pioneers of degraded or disturbed landscapes. And what I mean by that is that pioneer makes me kind of think of people with a bonnet on coming into new land, maybe in a covered wagon, and that's sort of what weeds do. They see an opportunity. Often the annuals will come out when there's land to be had. So when there's bare ground exposed, these annuals take advantage and grow. So after a land has been degraded, whether that be by overgrazing or drought conditions, whatever it is, when it's degraded or when it's disturbed, which could be a management practice such as prescribed fire, a lot of times these annual weeds will germinate and they'll come up and they'll be there to protect our soil surface. They'll reduce the rainfall impact when the rain hits the ground. Instead of that running that topsoil off, which is really valuable, it'll help to keep that soil moisture there and go into the ground for that subsoil moisture we spoke about earlier. Also, it reduces the solar radiation or the evaporation off the surface, and it does provide organic matter. So a second point is that, a second like, is that it's important for wildlife species. So we all know this, but wildlife species have a large component of forbs, and in fact our own cattle might have up to 15% forbs in their diet. So we talked about toxic weeds earlier, but a lot of weeds are not toxic, and they do fill in when we're lacking grass. Dislikes, I could probably name a whole list of them, but we're going to focus on just a few today. One thing I hear a lot is that they took over my pasture overnight. Seems like you're anticipating really lush forage grass, and then you go back out and you've got some weed that's really taken over your pasture. And what I'd like to focus on is the fact that sometimes weeds are there and we're just not really sure what we're looking for. And when we tell you to monitor your rangelands and identify weeds so that you can treat them before they're over 6 inches tall, that's really hard to do if you're not totally sure what you are looking at. So at this stage, would y'all consider this a weed? For the most part, the people here say yes, and then I see a few heads shaking no. So if we saw this in our pasture at this time, we may not be all that concerned. But come May, this is what this same forb is going to look like. Come August, you're going to maybe see some more grass mixed in, but these darker patches, those are the same forb. By September, they start to flower out. Does anyone know what this plant is? It's common broomweed. Yes, ma'am. Good job. So common broomweed can really kind of take over a pasture before you know it, but all along it was there. It's just that the smaller stages of broomweed don't look the same as the adult plant. So it's not until it really starts to flower that I start getting an influx of calls. And at that point, it's not that you can't kill it with herbicide, but it's going to take a lot more herbicide to do the job. Also, by the time it's flowered out, if it's an annual weed, it's sort of already done its damage. So it's already added that seed to your seed bank, It's already taken the place of a lot of forage grasses, so unless you're anticipating a large growth of your grass in the fall, there's really very little reason to even shred at this point because it's sort of done its due being an annual. Another thing we hear a lot is that they're taking the place of our forage grasses because any bare soil has the potential to either have grass or a weed. And so a lot of people who are especially livestock producers might see this as direct competition. What I'd like to encourage us to do is to evaluate if our grazing practices might be contributing to our weed population. So looking at this picture again, in the back, those trees have obviously been burned. I don't know if you noticed that when we looked at it the first time, but a burn was put through this rangeland, and then they put up an exclosure. So another one of those little exclosures I was telling you could monitor your land with, but this one's a little bit bigger. And if you can see the T-post in the picture, right here and right here, it's actually outlining the exclosure. And so you'll notice there's not a lot of weeds inside the exclosure, and the only difference between the outside and the inside is that the outside was grazed. So sometimes when we graze, we have good intentions, but if we graze too shortly and we expose more of that bare ground, that leaves it open for weed invasion. So here's a good example of when you have good grass coverage, you see very little forbs or weeds in this picture. But as we open up the ground and we allow more bare ground to be present, then it has a lot more weed invasion. And even still, more bare ground, more weeds. So in order for those annual weed seeds to germinate, it needs a number of conditions to be right. One of these is that it needs oxygen in the soil. So unless it's a plant that's adapted to grow in water, they don't take in oxygen from their leaves and move them down to their roots. The roots actually get the oxygen from the soil. And if you look at this little pie chart over here on the left, this 0.25% is actually air in the soil. This other 0.25% is actually water in the soil. And what do you think this big percent is right here? We don't have any guesses here. It's actually the mineral. So your sand, silt, and clay, which is often used to categorize soils, is that large percent. And then the little sliver that's kind of a dark pink color is actually the organic matter. So when we talk about these annuals dying off and adding to the organic matter in the soil, that's the percent we're talking about. So you need oxygen, you need moisture and rainfall, but as you can see from this pie chart, if this water percentage increases, it's going to move into that oxygen or that air area. So there's going to be a decrease in oxygen available for the roots if we have too much water. So we do need a good balance there. And then, of course, you need warmth coming from the sunlight. You need that soil temperature to be increased, and you need bare ground. So if we don't have the bare ground, or if we have grass covering the soil surface so the bare ground doesn't get the soil or the sunlight that it needs in order to germinate, those seeds will remain dormant again. So sometimes we hear they were never here before. I've never seen this forb. I've been on this land for 10, 15, 20 years, and I've never seen this forb before. Well, annuals have this life cycle, or this life stage, where they produce a lot of seeds, and those seeds go to our topsoil and they're weight in the ground. And a lot of the annuals, like common broomweed and woolly distaff thistle, can be in the soil for up to like 19 years. So if we will contrast that with a perennial, which is one that would come back each year from the roots, like an ash juniper, those seeds are viable in the soil for 15 to 18 months. And just for fun, like a honey mesquite, those seeds are good in the soil for about 1 to 3 years. So much longer on these annual weeds, they can stay dormant until those conditions are just right. And that's why a lot of times it's like the year of the something. There's always seems to be some weed that's coming out. Right now, we have common mallow out in a lot of areas. That seems to be popular right now. So conditions were just right for that weed for that year. Well, I already said that. So early in the season, that's when these annuals take advantage. So if you had bare ground on your land, you can bet that those are going to be filled up with forbs right now, and that could be a good or a bad thing depending on what you're hoping would be there or what conditions might be right for grass to grow. So another dislike, of course, is that they're poisonous to my livestock. And we learned earlier that About less than 4% of the plants we have in Texas are toxic. So it's really important to identify what plant you're dealing with. And then once you know the name of that plant, you can decide if that's something that you really want to treat and get rid of out of your pasture, or maybe defer grazing for some time in a pasture. But without knowing what it is, it's hard to decide or make those decisions. So let's talk a bit about weed and brush management. I always go back to 4 main management tools, one being prescribed fire, one being chemical treatments with herbicide, another being mechanical, where you're either disking, plowing, grubbing, and then biological, which could be like insects, or it could be using livestock to manage your plant base. So what I want to remind everybody is that when we do one of these management techniques, we're not looking for an instant gratification, although that's usually nice. A lot of times what you actually get from your management practices may take a year or 2 years or even 3 years to actually see the results you're desiring. So it's important to understand what ecological processes might be going on your land so that you can pick the right management tool. And this is an example of these pictures. It's in a row starting at the top, and then on the bottom it's a fire and how that fire, that land responded after a fire over time. So I want you to consider too, if you fed hay, and especially if you fed hay from another region this year, be looking out for plants that may come up that were in that hay. They may not be native to this region, but that doesn't mean that they're not going to do well. They're not well adapted for this region. So we definitely want to be aware of what's coming up in these areas. And also, if you did create sort of a bare area where you did sacrifice in a way to feed your livestock, you're going to have a lot of different weeds come up there. We want to make sure that you get rid of at least the toxic ones before you graze that spot again. So like I referred to earlier, it's best to spray weeds when they're 6 inches tall or less, because you can use a lower rate of herbicide and get the same kill as you would using a higher rate when they're a little bit more mature. You should make sure that they're healthy and growing, and that you've identified that plant so that you know which herbicide works best on it. Definitely pay attention to the flowers and timing. For the most part, you don't want the weeds to be flowering, but there are some exceptions. So make sure you either consult this B1466 chemical recommendation guide that you can again find on our AgriLife bookstore, or look at your product labels and talk to your salespeople, because they can help you out with identifying what product would be best for whatever weeds you're facing. Generally, we talk about applying herbicides in 2 different ways. One being a broadcast method, where you're probably going to use a boom, either attached to like a 4-wheeler or a tractor, or you could use a boomless nozzle now. They have quite a few that are pretty effective and cover a pretty wide swath. So basically, they just don't have the bar. They shoot from a single nozzle you would attach to the back of your implement. Or you could spray using the individual plant treatment method and use something as simple as a backpack sprayer or even a little pump-up sprayer that you have around the house. So we're going to talk a little bit about these 2 methods. The first, broadcast equipment, like I said, you're going to have probably fan nozzles on some sort of a boom, but you could also have these boomless nozzles. There's some that they get up to like a 15-foot swath pretty effectively. So check those out if that's of interest to you. When you spray broadcast, I encourage you to put out 20 to 30, use 20 to 30 psi or your pressure, and then put out 10 to 30 gallons per acre. But I would encourage you to more use like 20 to 30 gallons per acre, because the more water you put out with that herbicide, the more likelihood you have of covering those plants effectively and getting a good kill. Also, please calibrate your machinery. If you don't calibrate to where you know exactly how much chemical you're actually, or how much water you're putting out, how much mix, then you're either going to be overshooting or undershooting on your herbicide. And sometimes you may think that it didn't work, the herbicide didn't work on your plants, but in fact you weren't putting out enough herbicide because your machinery wasn't quite calibrated correctly. So here's an example of a backpack sprayer I was talking about for individual plant treatment. I know Mother's Day and Father's Day is coming up, and if you're like mine, they never know what they want me to get. So ask for one of these harnesses. They're great. They cost $50 from probably a number of stores, but I've got mine from forestry suppliers. They put the weight on your hips instead of your shoulders. I guarantee you, you can spray for a lot longer. And I know if I ask my father what he wants, he never knows. So maybe that would be a good gift coming up. Also, these backpack sprayers will hold up to 3 gallons of mix, but if you're doing like cut stump spray or a stem spray, you're really not going to use much mix. So unless you're really far ways from your truck, there's no reason to mix 3 gallons up at a time. So start out with a gallon or 2 and see how many plants that'll do. So I want to go through leaf spraying, stem spraying or basal sprays, and then a cut stump method, just to review, and then we'll talk a bit more about specific plants if y'all have questions on them. So first I want to cover leaf spraying. So leaf spraying is pretty simple. You're going to cover every leaf of the plant until it's wet, but it's not dripping. So you want it really covered. You can see the blue dye that he's putting out in this picture. I could probably look at your boots and tell you who uses blue dye. It's pretty nasty, but it's well worth the money because you'll be able to tell that you covered the entire plant. When you drive down the highway and you see a bunch of plants that have been leaf sprayed and they're all coming up from a single side, it makes me feel like they probably didn't use blue dye because they probably just missed one of those stems and it came back from that side. When you spray with the backpack sprayers, you have the opportunity to get different nozzles. So usually it'll come with a nozzle that you can dial down to be more of a stream, or you can open up to be more of a mist. But T-Jet makes some really good cone jet nozzles, and the larger the X, whatever number it is, the bigger the hole. So would you want a larger hole for a leaf spray as opposed to a stem spray, or a smaller hole? Actually, you want a bigger one, because if you have a bigger hole, it's going to spray out in a pattern and cover more of those leaves at once. So you always want to be applying the largest droplet size possible. But when you're trying to cover that amount of leaves, if you have a single spray coming out, it would take you forever and you'd waste a lot of chemical. So we kind of make it more of a mist. So we use an X8 is what we recommend on the T-Jet nozzle line. And also these 100 mesh screens down here in the bottom right corner, those are really cheap. They usually come in a package of 4 or so. And they are put in there behind the nozzle so that that nozzle doesn't get clogged up. And also if it happens to when you're in the field, it's easy just to tap them out, put it back in your sprayer, and you're good to go again. So that's a really cheap fix to add into your sprayers, inexpensive, and it'll keep your sprayer spraying for a long time. So generally when we do a leaf spray mix, we're talking about putting in the chemical, the active ingredient, to make sure you're using the right active ingredient in percent or poundage. You always dilute in water, so you don't use diesel on a leaf spray. You'll put water, but you add a surfactant. So a surfactant you can find just by the chemicals in whatever store you purchase your chemicals from. You want to get a non-ionic surfactant. I'm asked a lot if you can use dish detergent, which you can. But we suggest it as a last resort because dish detergents will foam a lot, and also they have those other ingredients in them that may not interact with the chemical as well. So if you can purchase a non-ionic surfactant, that would be best. Also add in that blue dye. So the blue dye, you only put, I think, 0.25% into your mix, so it's not very much, but it's well worth it because you'll know what plants you've treated. So if you're like me, you're walking around treating and you can't even remember, how your circle pattern went. So well worth the money. The surfactant, by the way, it's like what you would put in your clothes soap. So when it's in there agitating your clothes, it helps to remove the dirt so that your clothes can get clean. And these leaves on the right-hand side are an example. This top leaf here, it was sprayed without using a surfactant, and you can see the bottom leaf is really shiny, and that droplet has adhered to the leaf better, and that's because the surfactant was added to the mixture. So always add a surfactant for leaf sprays. Timing for leaf sprays, we say the soil temperature needs to be 75 degrees or higher. Well, unless you're like Vinny or I, you probably don't run around with a soil thermometer. What I would suggest is you watch the leaves, and when the leaves turn from this limey green, when they start first growing, to a darker green color, that's the time to treat. Right now, our mesquite trees are starting to bud out in Texas, and that means that in 45 days, they'll probably be primed for treating. So be on the lookout for that. Start getting your chemical mixes ready. Okay, so leaves all dark green, no new growth. So that means if we do get rain, which we're all crossing our fingers for, If we get that inch of new growth, that's the lime green color, just wait until that turns a total dark green again before you spray. Not that you won't get a kill while it's growing, but you'll get a better kill if you wait until it's all dark green again. So make sure the leaves are healthy, that none of Dr. Parker's insects have gotten on there and harmed the leaves. Quit spraying while they're flowering or while they're elongating their beans. So basically, we're trying to get that chemical in the leaf down to the root. And if we're putting energy out into either growing leaves or flowering or elongating beans, then they're not going to take that chemical down to the root as likely. So you might as well wait until they're not doing any of those things, and you're more likely to get the chemical to where you need it to go to actually kill the plant. And finally, if you mechanically mow these, a lot of times people will shred them down, especially if they have great big trees and they want to just individually plant treat. Go ahead and let that plant grow until it's a good 3 feet tall or so and has good leaf coverage before you treat it, because it needs those leaves to take the chemical back down into the root. Okay, stem spraying individual plants. This is also called the basal application method. Oh, that's all I have on that. Okay, so what you're going to do is you mix up your mix and you're going to spray around the bottom. So we'll talk in a minute about what mix you're going to use. But the important thing is to spray about 12 inches up and then all the way to the soil surface, all the way around that stem. If it's a multi-stem plant like you see in this picture, you have to do every single stem. So that's why you're going to see in a minute that we don't necessarily recommend this if you have a multi-stem plant. The cut stump method is another option, and they have similar mixes, which is why I'm going to talk about those together. But cut stump is where you would literally just cut it off, leave a stump there, and then you're going to spray the top and then any stem you still have sticking up. So our goal is to hit that cambium layer. If you think back to 6th grade, the xylem and phloem that's going up and down underneath that bark, you've got that cambium layer you want to spray really good and then fill it in. So that's the cut stump method. The way you remove the tree is totally up to you. You could use a shear. They have new ones with a really neat saw on the front that gets a really level cut. But you want to make sure there's no sawdust or dirt on that surface, because if you go to spray it with your chemical and there's dirt on there, it's not going to get on that trunk as well. So make sure it's a clean surface and preferably pretty flat. So I know if you use a hand saw, well, as the day goes on, I'm sure those get a little bit taller. So not only are you going to have to spray around on the stem you leave, but you also want to make sure it's flat, because if it's tipped, sometimes that chemical will run down and it'll regrow from that side. So keep those things in mind when you're doing cut stump. For a stem spray or a cut stump, we recommend that you use a ConeJet X1. So again, that means it's a smaller number and it's a smaller hole. So it's putting out sort of a single stream that's going to help to get that chemical in the largest droplet size as possible onto that stem. So also use the mesh screens as we talked about earlier. Sometimes, by the way, I use an X2 just because I'm impatient and it puts out just a little bit more chemical. But you want to kind of go for X1 or X2, whereas the leaf spray was a what? X8. Yep, X8. Okay, so timing implications for the stem spray. Basically, it's nice because you can do this practice all year long. Although it's better, you might have better kill during the growing season. You can use less chemical if they're smaller stems and smooth. So, you know, as the plant grows, it gets a lot rougher bark on it. You're going to have to up your chemical percentage. And it's best if it's a single stem and not a multi-stem plant. And that's not only because you have to treat each individual stem, and if you miss one, it will regrow, but also because we think there's this weird thing, like underneath the ground there's this bud zone. It looks like little warts on the stem, and that's what we're after. That's why if you mow over that brush species, it's going to regrow with multiple stems because it resprouts from these buds in the bud zone under the soil. So basically, if you have a multi-stem plant, sometimes you don't even see where they connect, right? It's underground and it's hard to even tell if that's one plant or two plants. So when you spray those stems, in between there, there's actually this weird saddle that may not get the chemical to it, and there may be a bud down there, and it resprouts from that one spot. So it may not even be that you didn't cover the stems real well. It may be the nature of the way that plant is growing just makes it harder to kill with a stem spray. Okay, so when you do a mix for either a stem spray or cut stump, you want to use a chemical mix, usually Remedy or triclopyr, and make sure if you use triclopyr or generic triclopyr that you're checking the active ingredient and the percent. Make sure it's the same. Also, the diesel is what you want to add. So you won't use a surfactant, you'll use a diesel as your carrier. I know diesel is getting a little bit more expensive, so I've been asked if you can use oil and a number of other things. That's fine. Diesel's probably the best and the easiest to mix up, but also still use your blue dye. So go ahead and put that 1/4% blue dye in there. That way you know what stems you've sprayed and that you've sprayed all sides of the stem and that you've covered that stump really well. And again, do not use surfactant. And the amount of chemical you want to use will be about 15% if you have a really smooth, small stem. But if you have a larger stem that you're spraying, go ahead and up that to 25% Remedy, 75% diesel. And then on a cut stump, we always recommend just to do the 25%, 75% mix. Okay, I want to go over real quick some new herbicide news, and then I'll answer any questions you may be thinking of. From DuPont, they have a new chemical that they're hoping to get labeled by the end of this year. It's called aminocyclopyrrolachlor. Right now they're calling it MAT28, but it will not be called that when it's released. Again, so they won't have to label till the end of this year, so it won't really be ready until the spray season of next year, 2013. But be looking for that. It looks really great on especially weesatch. We have trouble controlling weesatch on a broadcast scale. We have kind of good years and bad years, and weesatch seems to be really sensitive to soil moisture. So what I'm saying is, if we don't get a whole lot of rain the rest of this year, which I guess we're about to find out, if we don't get a lot of rain, then we may want to think about waiting until next year to treat, because sometimes on a broadcast level, we don't get a good kill when we haven't had good subsoil moisture. On an individual plant treatment basis, go ahead and treat. We really haven't seen a huge difference in that. Also, DuPont has some, well, you might be familiar with the herbicide Pastora. Usually it's recommended for sandbur control and Bermuda grass pastures, but they have a couple new 2EE recommendations for Pastora. One being a suppression for King Ranch bluestem or Clayburgh bluestem. So basically, it's labeled again for Bermuda grass pastures. It's not going to necessarily kill the King Ranch bluestem, but if you apply it at the rate of 1 ounce to 1.5 ounces per acre, and then you come back like 6 weeks later and apply it again at 1 ounce per acre, it will knock it back. So it may be good for a situation where you're trying to get something else to grow in that spot. Otherwise, bluestem's tough to get rid of, so it's probably just going to come right back. Also, they have a 2EE recommendation to tank mix Pastora with glyphosate, and they have a whole list on their label that refers to what exactly that will kill, so you might want to check that out. From Dow, we're lucky enough to have Benny Martinez in the back here. He's a sales rep with Dow, so he could answer any questions you have further about this, but it's pretty exciting. They have a new chemical, Sendero, that was just released maybe a couple weeks ago. It looks like it's really good on mesquite control at a rate of 1.75 pints per acre. And some of the data I've seen is better than our traditional Remedy Reclaim mix. So you might want to visit with Benny about that because Sendero is brand new. Also, Dow, you might want to check this out. Dow has a lot of reformulations where basically they're taking old chemicals and adding HL at the end, which stands for high load, and they'll be designated by this red oval. I was also told they'd have a red cap, although the one in this picture does not have a red cap, but definitely has a red oval on the box. And all that means is it's more concentrated. So you need to be aware, because if you were putting out, say, Graze On Next at 2 pints per acre, now you'll need to use Graze On Next HL at 1.5 pints per acre. So just check that out. I actually haven't seen it in many stores yet. I guess they're trying to get rid of their old stock, but that is coming, and they've done that on a number of their chemicals. Also, there's some generics available, which y'all are all aware of, especially in the liquid formulations. Make sure if you're going to use a generic liquid that you check the active chemical ingredient and the poundage or percent, because it has to match that name brand or that trade name that we're used to, or it may not perform as well. Also, you might want to be aware that chemical companies like Dow and DuPont, they provide extra product support that you may not get from the generics. What I do know is that I've seen some data where the pelleted form of Spike, if you're familiar with Spike, they have a generic now, and those don't seem to be, I guess, kind of disintegrating into the soil as well as the name brand Spike. So as far as pellets are concerned, until I get more data, you may want to just stick with the name brand Spike if you're going to go with pellets. And that's all I have. If I have time for questions.